We're back on another Saturday, this time to address Matthew 26, the fulfillment of Zechariah. Again. Now, in this accelerated chapter, we have a number of fulfillments once again. Fulfillments coming fast and furious. Fulfillments partying on Zechariah again. Partying on the minor prophet Zechariah, I guess, about some 500 years earlier. Prophecies just before the final book of the Old Testament, just before the long silent period of the prophets. And I wouldn't be the least surprised if Zechariah was the current study in the synagogue lectures at that unrestful time. Just to amplify things a bit for those deaf, dumb, and blind Pharisees, scribes and Pharisees that Jesus went ballistic on in chapter 23. A super nasty chapter, further indicating that not all evangelism is sweet and sappy unicorns and rainbows. Like this guy, right? Good old Uni. Oh, yes, we brought him along again, our mascot. Sometimes it is woe upon woe upon woe. Yeah, 7 of them, eh? Woe upon fools and upon blind men, upon serpents and upon sons of hell. Sons that we were at one point in time. Now, in case you missed it, our latter-day prophet Zechariah is also relevant with respect to the end times prophecy of our skipped chapter 24. And I wouldn't be the least surprised if that is where Paul got his Romans 11 from. That is an end time chapter of Matthew that simply may not be neglected in order for a faithful interpretation of the revelations of John. Your interpretation will be seriously skewed otherwise. Yep. Skewed like a ship in the Suez Canal or, well, I got no picture for you of that. To build on that end times, however, we have skipped chapter 25. Yeah. A chapter indicating that those end times will definitely apply to eternity. Yeah, eternity. There is absolutely no escaping the final verse of that chapter. No escaping. It definitely applies to eternity. Or some say everlasting. Whether you like it or not. Whether you think eternity is just a mathematical hypothetical or not. That time frame applies equally to both eternal punishment and to eternal life. The parallels are remarkable. You simply can't have it both ways. Which is to say that it does not refer to some escapist annihilation, as our commentator R.T. France will all too generously grant. Calvin and Carson will not, of course. That is an unbalanced position that Jonathan Edwards so thoroughly crushed in his sermon called On the Eternity of Hell's Torments. You can find that link there if you're going to click on it. A concept of annihilation that is also spoken to in this mysterious chapter of Zechariah. Yeah, chapter 11. A chapter that we are about to explore for further information. Yeah, for FYI. An annihilation that gets applied to 3 mysterious shepherds in that often overlooked background text of Zechariah. Shepherds which are quite possibly represent those very same priests, elders, and scribes that just got blasted in chapter 23. Applied to folks with certain judicial power that were corporately described as the Sanhedrin, or alternately described as the council. Basically, they were the Supreme Court of 71 significant folks, as opposed to the provincial court of 23 lesser folks to adjudicate over misdemeanors. A fearsome Sanhedrin council presided over by the high priest, naturally, presided over by bad old Joseph Caiaphas at this point of time. A high priest that was gratuitously appointed by the Roman procurator who ruled just before Pontius Pilate did. A high priest who was one of the many puppets of Valerius Gratus, a puppet appointed after a disciplinary firing of the previous puppet. This was a crooked council that was forced to move when Jerusalem was utterly destroyed soon after. Well, within that generation anyway. 40 years or so. A not so merry, now displaced band of Pharisees and hypocrites. A band that was later reestablished in the province of Galilee, of all places. A place that they held contempt for bad pronunciation. Check that out in this chapter. They didn't like their accent. Reestablished in the city of Tiberias for a period of time. Reestablished after being totally disbanded for hundreds of years. Totally disbanded for lack of an official biblical text or pretext to twist into another graceless law. For as far as we know, those official scrolls were destroyed right along with the Second Temple. All others are merely copies, unauthorized copies. With that graceless band later patronizing Tiberian vocalization, of all things, in order to establish a new official text, in order to establish an authorized text, an authorized version, in the order of our authorized standard version of 1901. With that development giving rise to something called the Masoretic text, somewhere around the turn of the millennium. Yeah, well, just before the year 1000, giving rise to a unique spacing of Hebrew words and giving rise to a multitude of Hebrew vowels that had never been written nor sung before. Basically, buying vowels in order that they could keep spinning their authorized wheels of fortune. And to that end, the text was not completely obliterated. The text was not annihilated, if that were even possible. Now, that annihilation word just so happens to get used in my NASB Bible. It's a cute little NASB that I kind of fond of. It gets used in verse 9 of chapter 11. But surely eradication, as you read in the net, or even be destroyed, as you see in the almighty ESV, is meant to be the inspired text instead. Destruction is surely meant, as per our excellent up-and-coming Canadian exegete Ken Penner. Check him out sometime. He is good. And I would highly suggest his excellent commentary on Isaiah, which is to say that there was a distinct cutting off of the influence of those unrighteous shepherds over Israel. A distinct cutting off. A distinct cutting off of those rulers by Rome within that very generation. Yeah, not in some distant generation to come. At which point, the bizarre cannibalism prophesied by Zechariah, check it out in verse 9, actually occurred in Jerusalem. And I mean literally. Literally. Now, you might argue that it's not as if that merry band were removed from all of time entirely, and it may indeed be argued that this is not an absolute condition, and that is true. Yet it may as well have been absolute, since that metaphorical staff of union that you will read in Zechariah, that union between Judah and Israel as a whole was fatally severed soon after that. Well, make no bones about it. It's fatally severed. That union was terminally fractured. That marvelous psalm of union between Judah and Israel that they would typically sing about at Passover, yes, they would sing that psalm at Passover, was terminally fractured. It would never ever become mere water under the bridge, so to speak, and has remained a bridge over very troubled water to this very day. To this very day. Different rules for Jerusalem. However, there was some semblance of union some 2,000 years later, when the diaspora that returned to Israel were forced to defend their land from the squatting Palestinians now. Land that was graciously consigned to the Jews by the United Nations in 1947 as a consideration after the getting beat up in World War II. Yet at that updated point in time, there was still a theological union only about as thick as water. Just as today, where there is an equal divide between democracy and theonomy in Israel, an equal divide between man-honoring and God-honoring, as if man is worthy of such an honor. Having said that, that water-like union was quite unlike the glorious covenant that is now being established in our present chapter of Matthew, being established strictly between Jesus and his devoted disciples, being symbolically established with his body and his blood, with blood being much thicker than water, of course. With that blood being established for a much, much longer time. A bloody covenant being explicitly written in the upper room. That's pretty explicit. It's not implicit at all. Too bad, James. An upper room, which is currently said to be in the basement of the monastery of St. Mark's. With that thicker covenant being signed with his divine blood on the cross. Yet the fulfillment of that covenant was just a wee bit further down the historic timeline now. That signature in blood was still about a day away, or about a chapter away in literary terms. What we have in the more immediate sense is something else being fulfilled, though. A prophecy about a different covenant being broken by one of the less devoted disciples, being broken by one of the disciples of Jesus immediately after Jesus irrevocably breaking fellowship with those 3 scary shepherds mentioned above. 3 scary shepherds, and we're not talking about those shepherds that came to see Jesus when he was born either. A covenant being broken by the most afflicted of the flock that kept faith with me is what we read in Zechariah 11:11. Afflicted with the very least of faith. Being broken by one of those disciples after being faithfully challenged to give the Lord his due. Check out that quote in Zechariah. Otherwise, to trade the Lord for 30 shekels of silver. Check out that quote. Does this prophecy sound familiar to you yet? Does this sound like the Judas Iscariot incident of this present chapter being fulfilled to you now? Yeah, but it gets worse. Much, much worse. Zechariah gets even more prophetic in our very next chapter of Matthew. He gets even more exacting, like Luke. Yet let's leave that prophet alone for now. Let's leave him till our next chapter. Instead, let's jump over to another prophet for now. Let's jump over to King David, who was also considered a bona fide prophet. Considered a prophet by all but the most selective Sadducees. So let's jump over to Psalm 22, which is also a huge prophecy that is currently being fulfilled. A prophecy nearly as majestic as the one of Isaiah 53. An earlier prophecy that is currently being fulfilled when Jesus prays for some assistance from the Father. When he prays earnestly in the grueling Garden of Gethsemane. Prays for some divine assistance for a time when he cannot assist his disciples at all. For a time when he is out of commission for a few days. Repeated prayers that the disciples only caught snatches of. Snatches between their naps. He prays not only for a certain deliverance of his soul in Psalm 22:20, but also for the distinct deliverance from a certain sword. A prayer of deliverance from the metaphorical sword of heaven, a sword of kingdom of heaven judgment that we've been going on about. Since taking on the sins of the world, he was certainly worthy of that eternal judgment. He knew it. Since any sin against an eternal God is worthy of eternal judgment. This was a metaphorical sword that was foremost in mind during each and every Passover. An inescapable thought and fear. A sword that would not escape them. A sword that just so happened to pass over the Jews just before their literal journey out of Egypt. But a sword that would never, ever leave them. Not even with the Second World War. That is the unwritten prayer of Jesus. If you regard Psalm 22:20 as being the least bit prophetic, that is. If you regard Psalm 22 to be speaking of the long-awaited Messiah, and most Jews definitely did, even if they refused to consider Isaiah 53 as speaking of the long-awaited Messiah. This is a psalm so incredibly messianic that it would be undeniable by even the most devout Pharisee, and likely the most selective Sadducee as well. This psalm rocked the world of psalms. And that sword concern of Jesus would be a perfectly legitimate concern. Make no bones about it. Particularly in light of the Zechariah prophecy of, "Awake, O sword, against my shepherd, and strike the shepherd, that the sheep might be scattered." Oh, and were they scattered? This was not directed at those three false shepherds. So Jesus then sets to waiting for an answer to that earnest prayer or three of his in the garden. After all, Jesus is appealing to a prophetic passage that speaks of a distinct answer to prayer. A very specific prayer that Jesus seems to be praying at a particular time. this particular time. Or at least praying in our very next chapter, as you cannot fail to see. But that's getting a little ahead of ourselves again. So he waits for an answer. He waits for an answer from some metaphorical unicorn, if you can believe it. What are you talking about? Crazy unicorn? Are you serious? Yes, from a unicorn, according to the King James Version of Psalm 22, verse 21. There we go. A unicorn. Cool, huh? Isn't that the freakiest thing? There's Codex Sinaiticus for you. Incredible. This King James Version is actually being true to the Greek Septuagint. Yeah. Whereas King James generally follows the Masoretic text. Whereas most other versions are a little more loyal to the more recent Masoretic text for some reason. A Hebrew text that seems to be getting a little bit loose in this respect. Seems to be a whole lot more convoluted. A Hebrew text devoted to an obscure answering from the horns of wild oxen is what we read in those other interpretations. That just seems weird to me. A little too animistic. And I happen to like horns an awful lot. Yeah, I like them lots. I like horns. Bugles. Bugles. Oh, well, wait a minute. Put a bugle on this guy. Yum, yum. Anyway, I like horns. It is as if we are being deathly afraid of being gored by wild oxen in those Masoretic translations. As if wild oxen are to be on a fearsome par with the lion's mouth or something. Oh no. Now, you thought I was just being a little funny and selecting a unicorn to be our mascot for this quizzing year, huh? Well, so did I. I only actually discovered this relevant gem while preparing for this particular study. Check this out. Yeah, look at all the passages you'll find the unicorn in King James Version. Freaky, huh? Yeah, I kind of like the one-horned, monocerata provision of a unicorn a whole lot better than the plural horns of some disparate dilemma. I happen to like it despite my general aversion to the King James Version. Again, I like that unicorn concept a whole lot better than some one-horned oxen. I'm reading one-horned oxen at any rate. Now that just sounds genetically deformed or just plain broken to me. Also, there seems to be a more profound sense of providence with a certain unicorn to be a little abstract. That wonderful provision of a horn of salvation for us in the house of David, his servant, as we might read in Luke 1, verse 69. And of course, it's referring to a cornucopia, which has its historical roots in the horn of a goat. Now, I simply don't see the plural of horns here, as if there might be 2 ways of salvation. Not only that, but there seems to be a more profound sense of unity with that unicorn as well, just to be a little punny. A certain unity that Jesus prayed for his faithful followers in John chapter 17. Anyway, that definite prophecy of a sword was eventually to be fulfilled in exactly the same manner that Jesus said it would be in Matthew 16:21 that we've been through. And just as David said it would be in that prophetic psalm of his, too. Just fulfilled a little differently than we would have thought, however. As most prophecies are. We would have expected some major battle. A battle with more than 12 legions of angels with swords blazing. That's in verse 53 of this chapter. A battle that would literally be a good 72,000 angels, give or take a few. An epic battle, you would think, but this was an epic non-battle. It seems sometimes you win by losing, or sometimes you gain by giving. Yeah. But let's look at one final difficulty before we close. Let's give you just one more dilemma. And not the timely dilemma, 3 days and 3 nights of Matthew. No, as France so aptly demonstrates, that dilemma is just facile like Facebook. Anyone concerned about that dilemma is simply being unfair and unfamiliar with common language, let alone Jewish timekeeping. Instead, what we are primarily concerned about is this scandalous charge of blasphemy. Yes, blasphemy. The horns of this dilemma is that Jesus never actually claimed to be God in Matthew. Not in the hyper-literal sense at any rate. Not in the hyper-literal sense that non-believers will try to smoke you with. Now, in this regard, France recommends the monstrous monograph of Darrell L. Bach. Oh, look, he's got 3 horns. A recent monograph on blasphemy that is so compelling that it has swayed a good deal of the academic community and would likely sway me as well, but I've only done a brief Amazon look inside on that book. And from that serious look, it seems to survey the issue quite exhaustively, quite thoroughly, and fairly. So to make a shorter work of that monograph, the blasphemy is fulfilled. Well, by the book anyway, the blasphemy is fulfilled in Jesus claiming to sit at the right hand of power. Yes, power. Dunamis. Power. As in our NIV, or as our NIV says, sitting at the right hand of the mighty one. Not a very literal translation. Not like power. A pretty lofty sitting. A sitting that not even Moses was worthy of. A claim making him equal to God, equal with God in power. To repeat a poke at that of Psalm 110 that we addressed earlier. A poke at those Pharisees. A poke at those shepherds that were currently in power. And that is your ultimate option as well. Either accept or reject that absolute power of Jesus. Accept or reject that horn of salvation. There are eternal consequences to follow.